Hi everyone! You've seen me play with the Turner Acryl Gouache for a while now, and I'm so pleased with how they handle and how opaque they are. And so today I wanted to push them to the limit and see how well they would do on black paper. So I do have some black watercolor paper, but I decided not to use it this time. I ended up using a Fabriano sketchbook that has black paper in it. So the paper is not super thick like watercolor. And I've had that sketchbook for a while now. When I received it, I was kind of disappointed because I really don't like the texture of the paper. It's all vertical lines and to me it just looks fake. And I knew I wouldn't like using it with colored pencils because of that. So I put it away for a while and I didn't know what to use it for. But knowing that gouache pretty much looks good on any surface, and acrylic gouache actually handles a lot of different kinds of surfaces, I thought I'd give it a shot. And one of the differences between regular gouache and acrylic gouache, at least with the Turner Acryl Gouache, is that you don't need to use as much water as with regular gouache. The paint spreads really easily, so I thought that even if the paper wasn't too thick, the acryl gouache should be just fine and shouldn't buckle the paper too much. So I found a nice reference photo on Pixabay and I sketched it on the page. I was not too worried about making mistakes because the gouache covers all the lines and everything, so it really didn't matter. So I just went straight on the paper. This time I didn't sketch my drawing on a separate piece of paper and transferred it on the black paper. I just went straight on the black paper. Once I was done with my sketch, I looked at my reference photo and compared it with my gouache swatches, and I took all the different tubes that I thought I would need, all the different colors that I thought I saw in the reference photo or colors that I could mix together to obtain those colors. I took one of my Stay Wet palettes, soaked the sponge and then wrung it, and then put it in the palette, put a little sheet of palette paper over it. As it happens, it was one that I had already used, but only half of it, so I decided to use the second half of it, so that I wouldn't have to throw it only half used. And I put all my browns on it, or at least all the browns that I thought I would need for the base color of the pine cones. I painted both pine cones, trying to avoid painting over my lines so that I wouldn't lose them right away. And once the base color was down, I took a little break, and actually that break lasted a couple of days. But because I had saved my paint in a Stay Wet palette, when I reopened the box a couple of days later, it was still nice and fresh, and I was able to continue using it as if I had just poured it on the palette. Which is really nice because not too long ago I painted something and I just used the paint on my ceramic palettes. And since it's acrylic gouache, it really dries pretty fast like acrylic. And these days, in the summertime, then it dries even faster. So I had a really hard time keeping my paint fresh on my palette. But I noticed that when I use my Stay Wet palettes, just having that wet sponge under the palette paper makes a huge difference. And my paint never dries. It's great. And I played with those palettes over time, trying to figure out how much water would work best. And so far for me, it seems like just getting the sponge wet and just wringing it so that it's not soaking seems to work great, because sometimes if you have too much water, it can kind of liquefy your paint and make it more runny. And when that happens, I really don't like the consistency of the paint. It's too diluted. So I was very happy with the way I did it this time. It worked very well. The paint consistency never changed. And again, it stayed nice and fresh, so it was great. So I played with the mixes of my browns and a bit of the white as well. I added some sepia and I tried to find similar colors that I could see on my reference photo, building layers and trying to show the texture of the pine cones. And since the paint actually dried pretty fast on the paper, the process was quite quick because I could just keep on adding layers and layers. If I made mistakes, I could paint over them, absolutely no problem. The paints are so opaque that they're really a pleasure to use. Once I figured out how to add the textures and the right colors to my first pine cone, I used some black and painted the shadows, and that really made everything pop. It looked really, really nice. It also helped me adjust my values after that. I realized that my pinecone was way too pale and I needed to add more shadows. So I mainly used some sepia to do that, and I added a little bit more textures, little dots, to show how imperfect those pine cones are. Having done that first pine cone made me a lot more comfortable doing the second one because I already knew which colors to use and how to do it. So the second pine cone went really fast. Once the pine cones were finished, it was time to add the needles. And even though the shape of the needles are very easy to paint, I was struggling a little bit with the paint. Some colors like yellows or the kind of green that I was using are not as opaque as other colors, and I think I was just putting too much water. So the green that I was putting down on the paper was nice and bright, but then kind of sank into the paper and disappeared. So it could very well be because of the paper I was using. I'm not quite sure, and I will figure it out once I start using watercolor paper with this color. But I had to add several layers of this green, and even then I was never quite able to paint a nice even wash. So I added a brighter green, which was a lot more yellow, and a little bit of white as well, and it seemed a lot more opaque, and it looked much better on the paper. So blending all those colors together worked pretty well. I just had to find a nice combination of different greens to show the shadows and the highlighted areas to make those needles really pop and look 3D. So once I was pretty much done with that, I again used my black to define some of those shadows. And when you use black on a painting that's done on black paper, it really is quite stunning, I think. So I think the Turner Acryl Gouache worked very well on this paper. It's barely buckled. I did use more water than I expected to use, but not too much, and the paper handled it pretty well. I really like this painting. I think it stands out so well on the black paper. And now I'm very excited to try it on the black watercolor paper because I know it's going to handle this paint even better. And I like the finish of the watercolor paper better. It looks a little bit more natural than this finish. But it actually looks just fine with the gouache. That's what I like with gouache. It doesn't matter what your paper looks like. It works really well. I've got a lot of watercolor paper that I really don't like using with watercolors, but they work so well with gouache that I'm so happy that I'm not going to waste that paper. So anyways, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're feeling generous, you can also click on that thanks button to support this channel. Thank you all for stopping by. I'll see you soon with another video. Bye bye!